Last time, we followed Sulla back from his campaign against Mithridates into a fresh round of civil war. Today, we will learn the outcome of this latest spasm of violence and what it means for the ailing Roman Republic. When we last left Sulla, he was preparing for battle just outside the Colline Gate. There, his forces faced those of the Samnite general Telesinus, who was fighting to preserve the rights of citizenship recently won in the social war. The battle began just after noon. Almost immediately, the tide turned against Sulla. His left flank were hard pressed by the fierce Samnites. Sulla himself attempted to rally his beleaguered troops, attracting volley after volley of enemy spears in the process. Eventually, the pressure became so great that Sulla was driven back into his makeshift camp, just outside the city walls. Many of his supporters ran back to the safety of the city itself, but were killed when the gates were slammed shut against them. The destruction of Sulla and his armies seemed to be all but assured. In fact, so confident were the enemy that they sent messengers to Praeneste with the news telling them that the siege would be all but lifted on the very same day. But on Sulla's right flank, things were turning out quite differently. There, forces led by Marcus Licinius Crassus, there's that name again, were having great success in pushing the Samnites back. As the day progressed, Crassus's force had successfully routed the Samnites, giving Sulla the relief that he needed to counterattack. The fighting continued into the night as Crassus pursued his enemy all the way to Antemnae, a full 2 miles north of the city. Telesinus and the other Samnite commanders were killed in the fighting. Sulla arrived at the site of this victory the next day. The people of Antemnae sent a delegation of 3,000 of their citizens to him, begging for mercy. They asked what they could do to be spared by Sulla, who replied that they could do some mischief to their fellow citizens and survivors of Telesinus' army, who had taken refuge in the town. And at that, a general slaughter erupted in the city of Antemnae, as the townspeople turned on one another. The following day, Sulla rounded up the survivors of both parties, 6,000 in total, and took them prisoner. These he marched back to Rome and led into the Circus Flaminius. He then commanded the Senate to meet in the nearby Temple of Bellona. Plutarch tells us what happened next. Hamadeltos telegein energeto kai katakopton. And at one and the same moment, he himself began to speak in the Senate, and those assigned to the task began to cut to pieces the 6,000 in the circus. The shrieks of such a multitude, who were being massacred in a narrow space, filled the air, of course, and the senators were dumbfounded. But Sulla, with the calm and unmoved countenance with which he had begun to speak, ordered them to listen to his words and not concern themselves with what was going on outside, for it was only that some criminals were being admonished by his orders. This gave even the dullest Roman to understand that, in the matter of tyranny, there had only been an exchange, not a deliverance. What followed this horrific scene was a repeat of the same type of lawlessness that followed Marius' seizure of the capital. These outbursts of extra-legal killings are known to us as proscriptions. The word prescription comes from the Latin pro and scribere, meaning to put forth in writing or publish. That's because, in happier times in the Roman Republic, the proscriptio was nothing more sinister than an official announcement of the sale of goods or property. It acquired its darker tone during Marius' seizure of the city, where he used the power of the state to declare his political enemies as enemies of the state, forcing their execution or suicide, along with the seizure and sale of their property. Now that Sulla was in control of the city, it was his turn. Note for a moment that Marius and Sulla were in opposite political camps, and yet their behavior when given unchecked control of the government was identical. well, nearly identical. One might argue that Sulla's round of proscriptions was more intense and generally worse than Marius's. What is always interesting to me, at least, about this kind of lawless behavior is the impulse to force it into the guise of legality. Sulla, having convened the Senate in the Temple of Bologna, commanded them to pass legislation giving him the power to proscribe his enemies at will. The Senate roundly rejected this proposal. In an act of supreme irony, he tried again the next day, this time via the plebiscite. Now that's rich coming from Sulla, champion of the traditional powers of the Senate. At any rate, the plebiscite passed, and the proscriptions were legally ratified. The first list published contained 80 names. Most of these were to be expected. Gaius Marius the Younger, Gaius Norbanus, Lucius Cornelius Scipio Asiaticus, Gnaeus Papirius Carbo easily topped Sulla's first proscription list. But then, just as with Marius's proscriptions, things quickly spiraled out of control. In the next 3 days, a new list was published. This one contained 440 names. Apparently, Sulla was easily influenced by his subordinates to put just about anyone on the proscription list. Many men found themselves on the list not because of their political activities or past allegiance, but because of private feud or jealousy. Of course, once a name was added to the list, it could never be removed. Incidentally, the proscriptions were not confined just to the city of Rome. The political purges soon gripped every city in Italy. That's because the proscriptions represented an incredible economic opportunity for those men in Sulla's orbit. Reward money was available for the head of any proscribed man. Informers, likewise, were compensated if their information led to the discovery of one of the proscribed. Slaves who informed on their masters were given their freedom. Furthermore, bribes were often forthcoming from those who were in danger of winding up on the list. Plutarch tells us that a young Julius Caesar, who was not himself proscribed, but merely called for questioning, escaped from the formal process by paying a bribe of 48,000 sesterces. Naturally, this whole nightmare was wide open for abuse. If one was a Sullan in good standing, living anywhere in Italy, one now had the power to accuse virtually anyone of having Marian sympathies, to have that person killed, and then acquire all of their property and possessions for pennies on the dollar. Or, you could just sit back and take bribe money for not doing any of that. That was the exact technique used by Marcus Licinius Crassus to establish his family's fortune, previously lost during the proscriptions of Marius. On at least one occasion, Crassus added a name to the proscription list purely because he wanted to buy the unlucky man's property at auction. Meanwhile, the former Marian generals were now running for their lives. The siege of Praeneste ended quickly upon the news that Sulla had defeated Telesinus. The garrison of the city surrendered to Sullan forces, while Gaius Marius the Younger retreated to an underground passageway in an attempt to escape. When it became clear that escape was impossible, Marius killed himself rather than be proscribed. As for Carbo, he learned of the disasters that had befallen his faction while hiding in Africa. Gnaeus Pompey Magnus was dispatched to hunt him down there and eliminate him. Carbo fled again from Africa to Sicily, and then from Sicily to the island of Corcyra, just off the coast of Africa. Eventually, Pompey found him there and murdered him, sending his head back to Sulla in Italy. When the head of his enemy eventually did reach Sulla, he displayed it along with the heads of other famous proscribed men on the rostra in the Forum. After this latest execution, the only man left to oppose Sulla was Quintus Sertorius, who was currently far away in Spain. In the absence of any real opposition, Sulla was the undisputed master of Rome. The trouble now was to determine exactly what that meant. As of late 82 BCE, Sulla held no official political office. Both consuls for the year were now dead, murdered at Sulla's order. But apparently, Sulla had a plan. He would revive the long-defunct office of the dictator. The dictator was traditionally appointed by the consuls during times of great military emergency. Since there was neither a military emergency in effect, nor were there any living consuls available to appoint a dictator, Sulla would need to find some other means to resurrect the office. The ancient sources do not quite agree how Sulla did it. Appian and Cicero describe a process whereby Sulla was elected to the dictatorship through an action of the Comitia Centuriata, and therefore by the people. But other ancient sources provide a different mechanism. Regardless, in 82 BCE, Sulla became Rome's first dictator in 120 years. Next time, we'll see what he intends to do with his new extraordinary power. I'm Matt Lupu. Thanks for listening.